Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday, and welcome to the DAR Museum's virtual lecture series. My name is Rebecca Quam, and I am the Curator of Education Outreach here at the museum. And I am here to welcome you all to our lecture and to introduce this month's speaker. Now, this month's speaker is our very own Katie Cannon. Katie Cannon is the Curator of Education Outreach, or excuse me, she's a Curator of Education here at the museum. And she has worked in the museum field for 20 years, and she earned a Master of Museum Studies from the University of Leicester. Her background has been primarily in living history museums, including George Washington's Mount Vernon and Conner Prairie. In her current role, she oversees the DAR Museum's education programs for all ages, making sure everyone gets a big dose of fun along with their learning. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box during the lecture, and Katie will get to them at the end of her talk. But without further ado, here is Katie Cannon.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. All right, delighted to have everybody here today. I'm Katie Cannon, and what I'm going to be talking about today is history myths. I will be specifically addressing museum staff and volunteers, who are the people encountering and combating misinformation. If you do not work or volunteer at a museum and you're just interested in this topic, then welcome. We're happy to have you on board as well. I have a presentation of about 20 minutes or so, and then I can take some questions. So please make use of the Q&A box for those. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. There we go. So the DAR Museum, if you're not familiar with it, is a decorative arts museum. Here's just a real quick glimpse into some of the objects that we have. Now I'm fascinated by history myths, and by that I mean the stories that you hear about how or why things were in the past, usually to explain something that we are looking at now, an object that seems strange or a phrase that doesn't make sense. Sometimes these stories are right. Sometimes there's some truth to them, has been maybe exaggerated or distorted. And sometimes they are completely and utterly bonkers. The thing is, these stories stick. You start hearing them in online discussions, in that email forwarded by your great aunt, and even at museums by staff or volunteers themselves. I am guilty of this. I confess it. I have told things to museum visitors that I then found out later were not true. So you all are witnesses to my confession. This is not a discussion of which stories are wrong and why. That's a whole other topic, although I will be bringing up a few of them as examples. Here's one that we hear sometimes at the DAR Museum. Usually related by a visitor who is so proud of their specialized knowledge, and then I have to crush their spirit when I tell them that it is not true. The story is to explain why some early American folk art doesn't look quite in proportion. Maybe the head's a little crooked or something. So the story is that back in the day, artists would save time by painting a whole bunch of headless bodies, and then the clients could choose which body they wanted head painted on. What a savings, right? Well, the problem is that there is absolutely zero evidence for it. No one's ever found a canvas with a headless body stashed in an attic somewhere. Unfinished paintings that do exist show that the artist started with the face, the most important feature, and an analysis of the paint layers supports this. This is a discussion of why these stories are so persistent, why we as museums just can't seem to get rid of them, and perhaps more importantly, what we can do about it. Spoiler alert, it's more than just saying, that's not true, stop saying that. So I'm going to look into the psychology of why these stories are so appealing, and then how we can turn these cognitive biases in our favor to fight back. So why do people keep believing outrageous stories that are not true? And then why do they stick more than your perfectly reasonable explanation? Well, the short answer is that brains are weird. Specifically, they are emotional and lazy. We like to think of ourselves as calm, rational beings. It's in the name, right? Homo sapiens, wise man. Well, surprise, your brain runs on emotions as well as thoughts, and emotions run the show more than you think they do. When something happens, your brain tags it with an emotional marker, and that's what we base our decisions on. They found this out with studies of patients who had had damage to the emotion-generating parts of the brain, and those people could calmly weigh facts and pros and cons, but could never make a final decision. So when someone says that something feels right, they are not wrong. That's what their brain is doing. It's feeling as well as thinking. It's a feature, not a bug. So brains are also lazy. Your brain is an energy hog. It takes up 2% of your body's mass, but uses 20% of its oxygen. Thinking is expensive, so your brain looks for labor-saving shortcuts. Mental shortcuts are called heuristics, and they make processing more efficient, which is not bad in and of itself. It's even necessary because cognitive resources are limited, but it does lead to cognitive biases. So let's look at some of those biases that we're working with that make people believe history myths so readily. One is, as you might expect, cognitive laziness. You spend fewer cognitive resources accepting a simple but false explanation rather than analyzing and critically evaluating it. The simpler an explanation is, the easier it is to remember. History myths tend to offer a simple, easy to grasp explanation of what is usually a complex topic, and it sticks in the mind more clearly than a long, involved discussion full of nuances. Another one is confirmation bias. People seek out and remember things that confirm their already held beliefs. Successful myths confirm preconceived notions of the past very often. So, like for example, nobody bathed, or people bathe, once a year or whatever. Well, this confirms preconceived notions that everybody was just completely filthy back in the day. Although historical accounts are full of discussions of cleanliness and bathing and how to remove dirt and stop from smelling bad. Did standards of cleanliness differ from the present day? Most certainly, and yet standards of cleanliness differ today between countries and populations. For example, many people are shocked and horrified to learn that, get this, Americans wear their outdoor shoes inside their houses. Oh, gross. Now, as an American, I grew up thinking that was normal, but I have since found that in other parts of the world, that is seen as very unhygienic. Another one is negativity bias. We are more likely to pay attention to and believe information containing potential hazards than potential threats, or hazards than potential benefits. This is because as far as our survival is concerned, a false negative of a danger is less costly than a false negative of a non-danger. If you hear a rustling in the grass and you panic, and it turns out to be nothing, all you did was panic for nothing. But if you say, oh, it's nothing to worry about, and it turns out to be a tiger, then you just got eaten by a tiger. Many of the persistent urban legends and history myths contain some element of danger, like the story that the leading cause of death for women back in the old days after childbirth was their skirts catching on fire and burning to death. That's pretty awful. A cautionary tale against wearing long skirts near an open flame. But it's not true. Yes, death by fire did happen occasionally, and it was horrible enough that people remembered it. But we have death records, and people wrote these things down. And by far and away, the leading cause of death for both men and women was disease. Actually, it still is today. So even childbirth, while dangerous for sure, was still not the main cause. So burning to death then was like shark attacks now. They're very rare, but they stick in people's minds. See, people later are going to ask you, so what was this talk about? And you're going to say, well, I don't quite remember, but man, there were flaming sharks and tigers, and it was awesome. So that's negativity bias. This is the bit that's going to stick in your mind. Oh, okay. This last one is my favorite because it ties everything together in just a beautiful package, and it's going to make everything make sense. I wish I'd had a better name though. It is called minimally counterintuitive bias. Yeah, I know it's not very catchy. So this is kind of it. This is the big reason why some urban legends and history myths persist, while others fade away. It's also incidentally behind a lot of the religious beliefs and stories. So what it does is, I noticed that it blends these biases together. So here's what it is. The things that stick in your mind contain generally familiar and plausible elements, that's confirmation bias, with just enough counterintuitive elements to make them memorable, and that's negativity bias. They also tend to be simple, which goes along with cognitive laziness. So with all this stacked up against us, what are we going to do? It is like stopping a train. Here's what to do. Do not stop the train. Divert it. In my not at all patented two-step program. It has 2 steps that match up with how our brains are emotional and lazy. So first, to address the emotional part. Step number 1, correct the misinformation, as you have probably already been doing, but you're going to be using positive framing. This is pretty intuitive. You're probably already doing it anyway, but now you have a fancy word for it. No one likes to feel stupid, right? And so attacking someone's ideas can be interpreted by their brain as an attack on them personally, activating that same fight or flight system that happens when your life is in danger. This is not conducive to winning people over with facts. It's all about your delivery and word choice. Deliver information in such a way that you are affirming their identity and personal worth, not destroying it. So identify with the person. Say things like, that would make so much sense, wouldn't it? But actually, or I used to think that too, until I discovered the truth, which is. So now that you've disarmed them and let them down gently without ruffling any feathers, you are ready for step 2. For that, I have a video demonstrating what we are going to do. And for it, I even got a really big name actor to help me out. Watch carefully, see if you can pick it up. All right, thank you, Indiana Jones. Although we're actually sort of doing the opposite. We are swapping the bag of sand with the real thing. We're going to create replacement stories that are true, but operate with the same mechanisms that make the myths so attractive and memorable. Let the brains be lazy, but make sure they're using those cognitive biases to arrive at the correct conclusion instead of the wrong one. Here's the magic formula. It is to first find a fact or story related to the myth, make it familiar enough so the person can connect with it. There's confirmation bias. And then with 1 or 2 shocking, emotional, or funny elements to make it memorable. And there's the negativity bias. So you put it all together, and that is minimally counterintuitive bias, which is now our friend instead of our enemy. But Katie, you say, it would be helpful to see some examples of this in action. Ah, I'm glad you asked. So let's go back to our friend, the painting. So if we're going to do this in real life here, step 1, You let them down gently about their misconceptions and tell them the facts. Oh, that would make so much sense, wouldn't it? But actually, there's no evidence for it. In fact, paint analysis shows that the faces were painted first, usually. And then step 2. But you know what's really interesting? Take a look at that paint used to make the painting. There is a good chance that some of it is poisonous. Some of the pigments they used at the time included, like you see those yellows, like in her brooch there, that could be lead or arsenic. And then the reds there, that could be mercury. And those browns, they actually made some brown paint out of, I'm not joking, ground up mummies. So don't lick the paintings. So that's got it all. Familiar elements like artists and paints, plus one shocking thing, poisons. Toxicity is fun. That was great, let's do another. Nobody bathed, or people only bathed once a month or once a year or whatever. Of course, practices are specific to time and place. So first you have to do the research on your particular place and time period to find out. But it usually ends up being more than people think. So here's an example of a story you could swap it with. If we're looking at the time of this painting, the mid-1800s, the sources, first of all, sources at this time recommended you wash yourself at least once a day, which is usually more than people think. But to do that, they recommend either a submersion bath, like we see here, or a sponge bath if you don't have as much time, but not a shower. I've got here a great quote from The Habits of Good Society, 1865. Of the shower bath, I will say nothing, because I feel that to recommend it for general use is dangerous. People thought you should only take a shower if you had a strong constitution, and that a submersion bath or sponge bath was better for general use. And that's funny because most people take showers now, and so showers being contraindicated is unexpected. Well, here's the bad news. You can't completely stamp out history myths. You're doomed. Sorry. But we must at least deal with the ones presented to us on a regular basis. It will take a little thought and planning, but if you keep hearing the same myth over and over again, you can at least be prepared for those. And then others will crop up suddenly and you will have no planning. Here are some of my favorite sources if you're interested in learning more. I have a whole bunch more. Also, I'll put a lot of these links in the YouTube description video, which is where this is headed once we're finished. All right, well, thanks very much. I'm happy to open up the floor to questions now. So I'm opening up the Q&A here. So if you have any questions, do put them in the Q&A box. I have so many things on my screen right now. I can't see the chat, for example. So if you use the Q&A box, that is the way to go. All right, Jane wants to know, do you have a good replacement story for the myth that quilts were used in the Underground Railroad? Oh, great question, Jane. It's funny, I've been thinking about that one and I haven't settled on one that I'm happy with entirely. For those who haven't heard, so there's the story that you will hear is that certain quilt patterns were used to give information to enslaved people who were escaping on the Underground Railroad. And it's a fantastic, wonderful story, except it dates to the 1970s or 80s. There's nothing before that. It's something that was made up in a book. And but it spread. People love that story. Oh my goodness, they love it. And it's a great story. But the thing is that there's so many wonderful, amazing stories about people escaping from enslavement that are true. And so what I would do is find one of those, especially if whatever area you're in, if you can find a true story of somebody who made a fantastic escape from enslavement, then tell that one. Tell that specific use their name, tell that specific person's amazing story. because then that is true, and you're sort of boosting knowledge of the absolute heroism that existed at the time, and that so many people exhibited. All right. Oh, good one. Patricia wants to know, is the term sleep tight based on the supporting ropes under the mattress? I'm so glad you asked this one, because it's one that I used to say, and then I found out that it's actually not quite true. I say not quite. So many of these stories are like partially true, and then things get blown out of proportion. This one doesn't bother me so much, because everything about it is true except for the connection between what the beds and the saying. So what you might hear is that the term sleep tight comes from the old-fashioned beds were strung with ropes, and that's what held the mattress up. And that is true, absolutely. And you had to tighten those ropes because they will sag over time. Also true, definitely, yes. I actually know somebody who sleeps on an antique bed like this, and she's told me about how often she has to tighten the ropes. The trick is that the connection between the phrase and the bed does not work. Because if you actually follow the etymology, which is learning the word, the actual history of the word or the phrase, tight is a word that used to mean well or soundly. So it's just saying sleep well, that's all. It's not as exciting a story too. That's the thing, and why these history myths stick so much is that the stories are fun, and the truth is often kind of boring. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that one. When I'm encountered with bed-related myths, one of the ones I like to bring up, and now it doesn't work for all time periods, but one of the ones that I like to bring up for the 1600s and 1700s is how often people shared beds. And not just family members too, but like people visiting friends, random strangers who are like traveling salespeople. I mean, we've got writings from the earlier days of this country about traveling salesperson comes through. Oh, sun's going down. Oh, well, obviously you have to stay with us, and so they just hop into bed with the rest of the family. So there's a lot less privacy than we're used to now. All right, let's see. Oh, Jessica wants to know if this is going to be on YouTube later. Yes, we are recording it. It is going to live on our YouTube channel along with our whole series of lectures. And so, yeah, I hope you'll check it out there. Mahia wants to know, how would you adapt these techniques for talking with kids who have stumbled into history myths, or do they work just as well with kids? Yeah, I mean, the basic here, let me flip back. It looks really funny going in reverse. Okay. So the basic idea here is all you're trying to come up with is a story that will stick. So actually, one of the scientific studies that I read in preparation for this was on children. They had done a study where they'd come up with different versions of stories to tell to children, and they had varying amounts of these elements of the things that were unexpected, shocking, emotional, funny, etc. And so they sort of found that like 1 to 2 weird things is the sweet spot. Less than that, if it's completely normal, if it's a story about a kid who goes to the mailbox and finds a letter, then like not very memorable. If it's a story about a kid who goes to the mailbox, but the mailbox doesn't really exist in time and space, and also it's actually a refrigerator, and it just goes like way off into left field, then also that's not as memorable. The sweet spot is in the middle. The stories that the kids remembered were things like the kid went out to, and I don't quite remember the exact stories here, but it was something like, the kid goes out to the mailbox to get a letter, but the mailbox has melted. So things like that. Where there's just and obviously that's a story that's not true, but it's illustrating the concept that we're talking about here, that what you're looking for is just something that's startling. So or funny or whatever. Those are the things that stick. Oops. All right. Was there anything else? Remember, I can't see the chat, so if you have any questions, Rebecca, was there anything that was coming through the chat that you saw?
We did have one question in the chat from Shirley. She asks, how do we impact the inaccurate storytelling that exists in school textbooks and are therefore furthered in schools? So if you had any insight on that, that's one of the questions that came in, along with some recommendations on stories to tell of individuals escaping enslavement, which are very important as well. But that was the one question about inaccurate storytelling in school textbooks.
Yeah, I mean, I work in the museum field, and so that's sort of my domain. You know, you can't win all battles. So I would hope if anyone is watching here who is involved in the school textbook system, then there's an idea for you, something to go out and see if you can maybe start making an impact. Study after study finds that museums are ranked extremely high in public trust in the information we present. So it's just especially important that we have our facts straight. But you know, it is good. It means that people are looking to museums to be correcting some of these things. And so yeah, so this is just the sort of thing, like in my museum work, if a school class would come and it's clear that they've encountered something that I know is that the facts support otherwise, you just have to be very tactful, because you certainly don't want to insult their teachers or their textbook authors. But you know, new information comes to light all the time. I repeated some of these myself because I was told, you know, when I first started working in museums, my mentors taught me these things, most of which were true, and then a couple things I found out later, whoops, that one's actually not supported by evidence. And so everybody's certainly meaning well. So it's just a process. It's just a constant. We're all just trying to improve ourselves and our own knowledge, right? All right, well, I don't see any other open questions. So if you think of something else, please do reach out to the museum later. We've got the museum inbox is museum@dar.org. And we're also on several social media spaces like Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So yeah, I hope we'll see you back for another one of our events, and